Arizona Territory. 1872. The sun beat down hard on the dust-choked town of Dry Creek, and Catherine Zeller hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her dress, once blue, had faded to a dull gray-brown, the hem ragged from too many miles walked and nights spent on hard ground. She stood near the general store with her back pressed to the wall, arms cradling her stomach like she could quiet it with just her hands. People passed her by, some glanced, some didn't. No one stopped, until he did. The cowboy dismounted in one smooth motion, boots landing heavy on the ground. His horse, a broad-chested sorrel, snorted and shifted behind him. He wore a trail-worn coat, dust clinging to it like it belonged there. His hat shaded a face that carried sun and silence in equal weight. He saw her, not just glanced saw. He crossed the street without a word and stepped into the store. Catherine's breath caught. She pressed a trembling hand to her lips, trying to hold her dignity like it was not already slipping through her fingers. The door creaked open again. He returned with a cloth-wrapped bundle and one brown bottle. He stopped in front of her and held it all out like he was handing her something sacred. "Here," he said. "Eat." Catherine blinked. "I what?" "Bread, cheese, apple, water's clean." "Take it." Her fingers wrapped around the bundle before her mind could catch up. It was warm, real. Her hands shook as she unwrapped it and raised the bread to her lips. She did not cry. She had run out of tears days ago. He watched her take a bite, then crouched beside her like they were equals. "You alone?" he asked. She nodded, chewing slowly. "My husband died last winter. My 2 boys were taken by his cousin, said I could not care for them, said I was a burden." He did not flinch. "What are their names?" "Francis and Ellie." "Francis is 6. Ellie just turned 4. Her voice fell to a whisper. "I miss them." He looked away for a moment, jaw working, then turned back. "My name is Fletcher Everett. I have a ranch about 20 miles northwest. It is quiet, good land. I came into town for supplies, but I was not expecting this." "Expecting what?" He stood. "You." Then he added, "I do not like walking past someone hungry. My mother would have boxed my ears for it." Catherine stared up at him, the food in her lap forgotten. "Why did you really stop?" He took a breath, then said, "Because you looked like someone who used to smile." Catherine looked down at the bread in her hands, then back up at him. "I do not even remember what that feels like." "You will." Fletcher put her on his horse and walked alongside as they left Dry Creek behind. Catherine had not said much, but she had not asked to leave either. That was enough for him. By the time the sun began to dip low, the land had opened up wide and empty around them. The wind carried dust and dry grass and nothing else. "You planning on selling me?" she asked quietly. He looked up at her. "No." "Taking advantage?" "No." She watched him for a long time. "Then why help me?" He stopped walking. "Because no one helped my sister. She died on a church step with her baby in her arms." Catherine's fingers curled tight around the saddle horn. "I was away at war," he said. "I came back too late." They stood in silence. The wind moved through the grass around them like a whisper. "I will work," she said. "I am not a freeloader. I know that. I can sew, clean. I used to cook for the schoolhouse. You will not have to prove anything to me." She looked down at him. "Then what do you want me to do?" He took the reins and started walking again. "Heal." The ranch was a simple spread, one long barn, a 2-room cabin, a fenced garden, and a dry well that needed fixing. Catherine stood inside the main room, her hand tracing the worn wood of the table. "This was your parents' place?" "No, bought it with my own money after the war, never married, no family left." She set the food bundle down. "Why not?" He shrugged. "Never found someone I wanted to keep." Catherine's eyes met his. And now Fletcher's lips curved, slow and unsure. "Now I am not so certain." She looked away, heart thudding too hard in her chest. She was not ready for that. Not yet. But she did not want to run either. That night, Catherine lay on the cot he offered her, the blanket rough but clean. The stars outside blinked cold and silent, but inside the fire crackled and threw soft light across the wood floor. She watched Fletcher move around the hearth, stirring the embers, adding a log, quiet as a man who had lived with silence too long. "You live alone all this time?" she asked. 3 years now. Lonely, sometimes. She hesitated. "It does not feel that way tonight." He looked over his shoulder at her. "No, it does not." In the weeks that followed, Catherine worked the garden, mended linens, and started baking bread again. She found herself laughing once, a real laugh, when Fletcher came in with his shirt torn from the fence he had been fixing. "You look like you fought a bear," she said. He grinned. "Fence won." She stitched the shirt that night by lantern light. He watched her from across the room. "You are good with your hands." "I used to sew all my boys' clothes." Fletcher's brow furrowed. "You ever think about going after them?" Catherine looked down. "Every day, but I had no money, no horse. No one would listen to a widow with nothing. You have me now." She looked up slowly. "I do not mean just for the ride," Fletcher said. "I mean, you have me." Catherine's throat worked. "Why me?" He rose, walked over, and knelt by her chair. "Because I see you. I see the hurt, the strength, the fight. I see what they missed." She reached out, fingers grazing his jaw. He leaned into her touch like he had been waiting for it. "I think I am falling for you," she whispered. He smiled, eyes warm. "Then I better catch up." By late spring, the mesquite had begun to bloom, small, pale yellow blossoms dotting the brush like a quiet promise. Catherine stood barefoot on the back stoop, the hem of her borrowed skirt brushing her ankles, the scent of yeast and dust clinging to her skin. She'd spent the morning kneading dough and humming under her breath, a tune she hadn't realized she remembered until her hands found the rhythm. Fletcher was in the barn, repairing a broken yoke. The steady rasp of wood on file carried across the yard. Catherine watched him through the open door, the way he moved with quiet purpose, sleeves rolled to his elbows, arms streaked with sweat and cedar shavings. The sun caught in his hair, now longer than when she'd first seen him, and she wondered if he knew how much she'd come to rely on the sound of his boots crossing the threshold at dusk. She stepped inside with a tin cup of water and held it out to him. He took it, their fingers brushing. He drank slow, then handed it back. "I was thinking," he said, wiping the back of his hand across his brow. "You ever been to Prescott?" She shook her head. "I never made it farther than Camp Verde." "Why?" "There's a circuit judge coming through next week. I have business there." "Thought you might come." Catherine tilted her head. "What sort of business?" Fletcher leaned against the workbench. "Land paperwork, and I need to speak with someone about custody petitions." Her breath caught once in her chest. "For Francis and Ali," he nodded. "I asked around. Their cousin moved them south, Fort Thomas area. If we want to have a say, it has to go through the court." The barn felt suddenly too still. Catherine set the cup down beside a coil of rope. "And you'd help me do that, I told you." "You're not alone." She crossed her arms, not in defiance but to hold herself steady. "And if the court says no, then we try again. As many times as it takes." Catherine's throat tightened, but she didn't look away. "Why are you doing this?" Fletcher's voice came low. "Because I see what was taken from you. And because I want to build something real with you, not out of pity but out of respect." She stepped closer. "And if I say yes to Prescott, then I'll ride beside you." That night, she lit the oil lamp and brushed out her hair in front of the cracked mirror. Fletcher had left her a folded shawl on the table, wool, dyed dark green, with a stitched edge that looked like his hand had done the work. She ran her fingers over the threads and thought of all the ways silence could carry meaning. The next morning, they packed light. Catherine bundled dried meat, flatbread, and a small tin of beans. Fletcher saddled the horses, the second one lent from a neighbor. a gelding with a notch in its ear and a calm gait. Catherine mounted with practiced ease, despite the months gone by since she'd last ridden. The trail to Prescott wound through low hills and cottonwood groves, the air warm and dry. They didn't speak much, but there was comfort in the quiet. At midday, they stopped near a creek. Fletcher unwrapped a parcel of dried figs while Catherine washed her face in the cold water, her reflection rippling beneath her. "I remember thinking once," she said, sitting beside him on a flat stone, "that I'd never have a choice again. That surviving meant taking whatever came, even if it hurt." He offered her a fig. "And now," she took it, chewing slowly. "Now I feel like I'm beginning again, even if I don't know how to name it." Fletcher looked out at the cottonwoods. "You don't have to name it. Just keep walking toward it." In Prescott, the streets were busier than she expected, wagons rumbling over ruts, merchants hawking dry goods, and women in calico skirts threading between shops. Catherine kept close to Fletcher as they entered the courthouse, the wood walls smelling of ink and old paper. The clerk behind the desk raised an eyebrow when Fletcher introduced her. "You're filing on behalf of a widow." Fletcher didn't blink. "We have the names. The situation's unjust." "She has every right to ask." The man gestured toward a ledger. "Then she'll need to sign here and swear to her standing." Catherine held the pen with steady fingers. When her name dried in ink across the page, she felt something inside her shift, like a door cracking open where none had been. Afterward, they walked through the outskirts of town, past a cluster of small homes and a stable. Catherine paused near a fenced pasture where a girl not much older than Frances led a mule on a rope. "I wonder if they remember me," she said softly. Fletcher rested his hand on the rail beside hers. "They will." That night they stayed in a boarding house on the edge of town. Fletcher took the cot in the corner without protest, letting her have the bed. He sat near the window, boots off, shirt sleeves rolled, watching the moon rise. "I don't know what happens next," she said from the bed, the covers pulled to her chest. "That's the good part," he replied. "We get to decide it." She turned toward him, the lamplight catching the curve of her cheek. "I want to start again, not just for them, for me." He nodded once, slow. "Then let's make something worth keeping." Catherine held his gaze, no fear in her this time. "We already are." The days following their return from Prescott brought a thick heat over the hills, the kind that soaked into the wood of the cabin and made sleep light and restless. Fletcher rose early, before the sun breached the ridge, and Catherine often found him outside tending to the livestock in silence, his posture tighter than before. She didn't press him. Whatever weight he carried from that courthouse visit hadn't settled yet. By mid-June, a rider from Fort Thomas arrived with a folded letter bearing the judge's seal. Catherine stood on the porch as Fletcher read it aloud, the breeze tugging at the paper's edge. "The court will hear your petition in person," he said. "You're to appear by the end of July. It doesn't guarantee anything, but it gives you standing." She stared at the ground a long moment before raising her eyes. "It's more than I thought I'd ever get." Fletcher folded the letter and slid it into his coat. "It's a start. You want company. I wouldn't go without you." That night, Catherine sat on the cabin floor mending a tear in Fletcher's work shirt. Her fingers moved automatically, but her mind wandered. He was seated near the window, carving something small from a cedar branch. She watched the curl of wood fall to the floor, then asked, "What made you stay here on this land?" He didn't look up. "I came through during a cattle drive. Got thrown from a horse near the ridge. A family took me in, nursed me back. They moved on, but I stayed. Felt like the first place I didn't have to explain myself." "You ever want to leave?" He tapped the blade against the wood. "Sometimes. Then I look out at those hills and remember how quiet they were the night I almost gave up." Catherine folded the shirt and set it aside. "You never told me that," No reason to, until now. She walked to where he sat and knelt beside him. "I'm not whole, Fletcher, not yet." "I don't need whole," he said. "I need honest." She reached for his hand, calloused and warm. "Then I'll give you that." Every day. They left for Fort Thomas at dawn 2 weeks later, the air still and heavy. The ride took 4 days, and they passed through land scorched by sun and wind. At night, they camped near dry creeks and under mesquite branches, sharing coffee boiled over fire and quiet stories neither had spoken aloud before. On the second night, Catherine sat wrapped in her shawl, watching the flames flicker low. "I used to dream of raising my sons near water," she said. "A place with trees and frogs and soft dirt, somewhere they could run without fear." Fletcher passed her a tin mug. "That's not a dream, that's a plan." She sipped slowly. "You think we could find a place like that?" "I think we could make one." The courtroom in Fort Thomas was a small adobe square with cracked walls and a crooked flagpole. Catherine stood before the judge in her best dress, her hair pinned neat, hands clasped to keep them from shaking. Fletcher stayed behind her, steady as shadow. The cousin, Rupert, arrived with a lawyer and a stiff jaw. He called her unstable, said she'd abandoned the boys, that she was unfit. Catherine didn't flinch. She told the judge what she'd endured, the loss, the hunger, the silence in her belly the day she met Fletcher. And she told him without trembling that she would never leave her children again. The judge asked few questions. His eyes lingered on her and once on Fletcher. Then he nodded. "I'll issue a ruling in 3 days. You'll be notified." They walked out into the dust and heat, neither speaking until they reached the horses. "I didn't know I could be that brave," she said. Fletcher adjusted the saddle girth. "You weren't brave, you were honest. That's harder." They stayed in town, waiting. On the second morning, a court runner delivered the ruling. Catherine sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling as she unfolded the paper. "He granted me custody, says I can take them home." Fletcher didn't speak. He just knelt and pressed his forehead gently to her knees, his hands on her thighs as if grounding them both. She buried her fingers in his hair, whispering, "I never thought I'd be whole again." He looked up at her, eyes wet but steady. "You're not alone anymore. And you never will be." They rode to the boarding house where Francis and Ellie had been kept. The boys came out cautiously, Francis holding Ellie's hand tight, both pale and uncertain. Catherine knelt. "Francis, Ellie, I'm here." Francis blinked, then stepped forward slowly. "Mama," she opened her arms. "Yes, baby. Yes." They ran to her then, both of them, and she held them close, her tears soaking their hair. Fletcher stood beside them, hat in hand. Francis peeked up at him. "Who's he?" Catherine smiled through her tears. "He's the reason I found my way back." Ellie clung to her waist. "Can we go home now?" She looked at Fletcher. He nodded. "Yes," she said. "We're going home." The boys had never seen a stovepipe chimney before. Francis circled the cabin twice, making quiet note of the way the smoke curled from it, while Ellie crouched near the garden fence, watching a grub inch through the soil. Catherine stood on the porch, one hand on her hip, the other shading her eyes as she watched them, her boys, on Fletcher's land, where she had once arrived with empty hands and no voice left to raise. Inside the cabin, the floor had been scrubbed, a second cot added by the window, and a shelf built low so the boys could reach it. Fletcher had done it without a word, sometime between the court ruling and the day they gathered their things in Fort Thomas. Catherine hadn't asked. She hadn't needed to. At supper, Ellie pressed his cheek to her sleeve. "Is this our house now?" She met Fletcher's eyes across the table. He leaned back, arms folded, expression unreadable but soft with something old and steady. "It's our home," she said. "Ours to keep." That evening, after the boys had fallen asleep curled beneath quilts stitched from old shirts and flour sacks, Catherine stepped outside. The sky was thick with stars, the kind she hadn't seen in years. Fletcher was seated near the fence rail, one leg hooked over the bottom rung, a cigar burning low between his fingers. "I thought they'd be scared," she said. "They weren't," he answered. "They knew you were sure." She stayed quiet a moment, then joined him, settling beside his boots in the grass. "I've never had to be a mother and a woman at the same time. One always got pushed aside." He let the silence stretch before answering. "You don't have to choose here." Catherine turned toward him. "What about you? You've carved your life into this land. Now there's noise and toys and questions every 5 minutes. I've had worse company." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You could have had any kind of life. You didn't have to take me in." Fletcher tipped ash into the dirt. "You weren't taken in, you were recognized." He stood, stretched his back, and offered her a hand. "Let's go inside. It's cold." The days lengthened, and the boys settled into the rhythm of ranch life without being asked. Francis took to feeding the hens, and Ellie followed Fletcher like a shadow, asking about bridles and fences and why horses blink sideways. Catherine watched them from the porch, mending a pair of trousers one afternoon, and realized her hands no longer shook. That night, after the boys had gone to sleep, she lit a candle and found Fletcher outside again, this time checking the hinges on the barn door. "You want to marry me?" she asked. He turned slowly. The wind had picked up, and it carried the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain. "Is that a proposal?" he asked. "No, it's a question." He stepped forward, his hands still rough with fence work, his eyes steady. "I'd marry you tomorrow if you asked. I'd say yes today if you did." He didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a narrow ring of braided silver wire, not polished, not store-bought, handmade. "I didn't know when to ask," he said, "but I made it on the ride back from Fort Thomas." She held out her hand. He slid the ring on, his fingers lingering over hers. "You're not what I expected." She looked up into his face, close enough to see the scar at his temple. "You're what I never dared hope for." They married beneath the cottonwood tree at the edge of the pasture, with the boys standing close and the mare Fletcher had raised from a filly grazing nearby. No preacher, no crowd, just an oath spoken plain and true, hands joined, hearts steady. That night, with the boys asleep and the fire low, Catherine lay beside him on the cot they now shared, their legs tangled under the quilt. Her head rested on his chest, her ear over his heartbeat. "I used to pray to disappear," she whispered. "And now I pray to stay." Fletcher pressed his lips to her hair, his voice quiet as the hush before dawn. "And you will, for as long as you want." Outside, the wind stirred through the grass. Inside, the quiet was full of peace. The wedding ring left a faint impression on Catherine's skin when she kneaded dough in the early morning, before the boys stirred, and before the sun reached the edge of the barn roof. It wasn't the ring itself that mattered, silver wire, worn smooth by Fletcher's thumb, but the weight of it, the steadiness. She wore it like a rooted thing, not fragile but living. Fletcher had cleared a small patch of land beyond the garden where the soil was soft and dark beneath the hardpan. He worked it slow, a few rows each week, and never said what he meant to plant. One afternoon, Catherine stood beside him, watching as he shifted a worn sack from his shoulder and opened it to reveal a scattering of seeds. "Sunflowers," he said, pouring a handful into her palm. "I saw them once on the edge of a field in Kansas. Thought the boys might like them." "They'll tower over everything," she said, smiling. "I know." In July, rain came late. The wild grass turned brittle and the creek behind the ridge ran shallow. Catherine walked the fence with Francis and Ellie most days, showing them how to check for broken slats, how to spot coyote prints in the dust. They listened with the quiet seriousness of boys who'd been made to grow up too fast. One evening, Fletcher came in with a shallow cut across his forearm, a splinter lodged too deep to pull free with bare hands. Catherine set a kettle to boil and reached for the needle she kept in the tin box by the hearth. He sat still while she worked, his jaw tight but his eyes never leaving hers. The needle came out clean and she pressed a cloth to the wound. "You always bear pain like it's familiar," she said. "I don't see much use in hollering." "You don't have to holler, but you don't have to hold it alone either." He caught her wrist before she turned away. "I don't," he said. That night, she lay beside him with her head on his chest, the boys asleep in the other room and the wind whining low around the corners of the cabin. His hand rested over hers where it lay across his ribs. "I've been thinking," he murmured, "when the sunflowers grow tall, we could build a swing for the boys, a place they can shout and forget everything that came before." She ran her thumb along the back of his hand. "And for us, we'll sit beneath them. Let them shade us." In late August, a letter came from the woman who'd once taught alongside Catherine in the Dry Creek schoolhouse. She'd heard of Catherine's return, the custody ruling the marriage. Her words were plain but kind, and she asked if Catherine might come back to teaching just part-time, 2 days a week in the new school that had risen near the town's edge. Catherine read the letter twice, then tucked it in her sewing basket. That night, while the boys played jackstones under the table, she turned to Fletcher. "They want me to teach again." He didn't look surprised. "Will you?" She nodded slowly. "I think I might, not because I have to, because it's part of me." He reached across the table and rested his hand over hers. "Then say yes." The first morning she walked into the schoolhouse again, the floorboards creaked under her boots, and the chalk dust smelled like memory. Fletcher had ridden with her, waiting outside with the boys on the back of the wagon. She looked over her shoulder once, saw him tip his hat, and felt steadier than she had in years. While Catherine taught, Fletcher and the boys stayed busy. They dug post holes for a new line of fencing, gathered rainwater in barrels, and built a pen for the hens. In the evenings, Catherine read aloud by lamplight, her voice weaving stories through the cabin while Fletcher carved shapes from cedar to keep the boys' hands busy. In September, the sunflowers bloomed. They rose taller than Francis, taller than Fletcher's shoulder, golden heads bobbing in the breeze. Ellie ran between them laughing, and Fletcher carried up a length of rope and a slab of smooth pine. The swing hung low, tied firm between 2 posts at the garden's edge. Catherine stood back and watched as the boys took turns, their shrieks carrying across the field like music. Fletcher came to stand beside her, brushing the dust from his hands. "You think they remember what it was like before? They don't need to," she said. "They've got this now." The next morning, Catherine packed a pie wrapped in cloth and a tin of dried apples. They rode to town together, the boys squeezed between them on the wagon seat. People tipped their hats. Some stared, but no one looked away. At the mercantile, Francis tugged at Catherine's sleeve and pointed to a shelf near the counter. "Can we get the slate board?" he asked. "I want to practice like Mama teaches." She glanced at Fletcher, who pulled 2 coins from his pocket and passed them to the clerk without a word. On the ride home, Catherine rested her head against Fletcher's shoulder. The fields passed slow and golden, the dust rising behind them in low curls. "I didn't know a life could be like this," she said softly. "You built it," he said. "With you," he turned his head, pressed a kiss against her temple. "We built it together." As September deepened into October, the nights cooled, the garden thinned, the hens grew quiet. But inside the cabin, the warmth remained. One night, Francis pressed a folded paper into Catherine's hand. She opened it to find a drawing 4 stick figures beneath tall stalks of sunflowers, a swing in the middle, a line of smoke curling from a chimney. "That's us," he said. "Our family." Catherine pulled him close. "Yes, baby, that's us." Time moved slow and sure. The cabin held firm through the first frost. Catherine taught, Fletcher worked the land, and the boys grew strong and sure-footed. No ghosts lingered, no old names returned. Just four people, bound not by blood, but by choice, by care, by the quiet promise of each day's return. And in the evenings, as the fire burned low and the boys dreamed in their quilts, Catherine and Fletcher lay curled beside one another, their hands laced, their breath steady, not waiting, not hoping, just living together in the home they had made with nothing but grit, kindness, and love that asked for nothing but the truth.